Just going to give a few updates on some general items on weed control and some updates on research from this past 2021 growing season for weed control and dry beans. So here's basically the three topics I want to cover today. Some update on our cover crop for weed control research, primarily research from Greg Indris at Carrington. A little couple notes on ragweed, since the questions on ragweed continue to flow in on an annual basis, and then updating some water hemp research that I had in my program this past year. So for the first topic about cover crops in dry beans for weed control, I always find it interesting to use the survey that we use every year and track, especially over the past couple of years. And I found it interesting that in 2018, we had one respondent from North Dakota say that they were using cover crops for the purpose of weed control. And then I did not update with the last one, but in 2020, we were up to about almost 50% of survey respondents who were using dry beans said that they were using them for weed control. And so I think that's a pretty interesting shift over the past couple of years of a primary purpose for using cover crops for them dry beans. I think that's a good transition to talk about and share the research that Greg has conducted at Carrington since 2017. So he likely would have shown some of their impacts on yield data earlier this morning. I apologize, I was not here for his session. But as far as weed control, I can really summarize in about 3 slides what he has seen over the past couple of years. And so to make us all familiar with the treatments that Greg was evaluating, we have across the x-axis the 6 different treatments evaluated over this time period. This is just the results for 2020. But essentially, we had a conventional till check where we just had a pre-emergence herbicide applied at planting. In this case, it was Spartan Elite. Treatment 2 was a cereal rye cover crop established in the fall and then terminated 36 days before planting pinto beans. Treatment 3 is that same termination timing of the rye, but then coming back at planting with that Spartan Elite pre-emergence herbicide. And then we have a couple different termination timings without the residual herbicide. So 20 days before planting, 1 day, and then 11 days after planting pinto beans coming in and terminating that cover crop. So we have 2 different colored bars. Yellow would be a combination of green and yellow foxtail, and then gray is common lamb's quarters. And some of the things that stick out to me on this chart are that the best treatments as far as control of the grasses, the yellow bars, in this case would be our conventional check, but then we had a pretty equivalent control when we terminated the rye 36 days before planting and then had that pre-emergence herbicide. Compared to if we just terminated the rye and did not add Spartan Elite, we did see a drop-off in performance on the foxtails. But then the other 2 treatments with very excellent control in 2020 of the foxtails would have been where we planted green, essentially. So planted the pinto beans into the rye and then sprayed it with glyphosate later to kill the rye off. So do not have the residual herbicide, but still had pretty good control of yellow foxtail and lamb's quarters, in this case in 2020. So showing those because, again, we can get some weed control, pretty good weed control in a system where we plant green. But I know that Greg has mentioned, and I'm sure he did mention earlier, we can have some yield loss due to the rye using up too much moisture and the dry beans just not being able to recover from that moisture competition. So 2021, last year, was, of course, a challenging year in many ways. And I think that is reflective in the overall weed control that Greg saw in these trials at Carrington. So again, same treatment structure. The days are moved a little bit. So rather than 36, it's now 29 days before planting, 16 days, and then the day of planting and 9 days after. Overall, we were not getting complete weed control with any program in 2021. May and June a little bit hotter and a little bit drier at Carrington than May and June of 2020. So that's part of why we had overall reduced weed control. The trends among the treatments are about the same, however, though. So equivalent weed control if we terminate the rye early and then apply the residual herbicide at planting. And I know this treatment did not have a yield reduction compared to the planting green treatments in this particular trial. So again, showing what maybe compared to something like soybean, where we can get away with planting green and maybe not experiencing a yield loss. As far as pure weed control goes, we can see good weed control with this planting green treatment, but if we factor it into the overall system, not quite as good, since we do have that moisture competition. But if you have rye planted for other reasons, anchoring the soil over the winter or whatever other agronomic reason you prefer, if we terminate it early ahead of planting, use that pre-emergence herbicide, we're going to get very equivalent control to our conventional way of tilling and planting pinto beans. So as an overall system thing, that's where I'm seeing a lot of promise from Greg's results. And again, just something to evaluate over multiple years. And again, continues to look promising. Just we do need to manage that rye biomass to make sure it doesn't become a weed itself and use up too much moisture for us. And so this chart basically is a compilation of research from 2018 through 2021 across a number of different species. Important to point out here that many of these species were only available in one research trial, so only in the research for 1 year. Where we had multiple years would be the foxtails, available in 9 different research trials, and just showing that using rye, if we average across all treatments, we can get a range from 0 to 99% control of foxtails, relying on rye for weed control. And again, that's just kind of a way to lump a bunch of the data together and show that we do need to kind of look at the individual treatments and see what does work. We can't just say we'll put rye out there for weed control and it's going to work every time. So I think it's a nice way to visualize that we can get quite a range in response from the data. And we need to talk about this in a more intricate manner rather than just saying rye for weed control. So moving on from cover crops, just a couple of notes here on common ragweed. Again, one of our most problematic weeds that we'll have, especially up and down the valley here, and certainly as you go west in North Dakota and east into Minnesota as well. So everyone on board here or on the call should be dealing with this as a major issue. Why ragweed is particularly problematic in dry beans, we have quite a lot of group 2 herbicide resistance. These are the ALS inhibiting herbicides, things like permit will probably be the one that we use most in dry beans. We have quite a bit of resistance to that class of chemistry. And then we do have some resistance to group 14 herbicides like sulfentrazone, which is in Spartan, or then famecifin, which is Reflex. That is likely. We have not confirmed any, but certainly with some field visits where these herbicides aren't performing like they used to, it seems like we do have some resistance to that class of chemistry as well. Why this is important for dry bean production is if we have a stacked group 2 plus group 14 resistant common ragweed in a field, that's basically a no-win scenario for controlling ragweed in dry bean from a chemical perspective. So we don't have any direct data on something like a rye cover crop to control common ragweed. I think that would be a promising combination because ragweed tends to emerge pretty early, but it's important just to drive home if you have that stacked combination of resistance, we don't have the chemistry to completely control ragweed in a dry bean crop. And so this is why I think we're continuing to get more fields with issues in dry bean across the region, and why these calls continue to come in as these types of resistance spread. Just going to be a lot more difficult, if not impossible, to clean out of a dry bean field. And so a couple of pictures here of what one of these very problematic fields would look like. So this is one not too far from where I'm sitting here on Fargo's main campus. But this was a pinto field, or I should say a dry bean field in September a couple years ago. And the yellow parts of the field are the dry beans that are turning. All this green above the yellow canopy is just all the ragweed that escaped the herbicide program. This one was reliant on permit and famecifin or Reflex to get control, and clearly was not getting good weed control on common ragweed, as you can see by this essential monoculture of common ragweed in this field. So as ragweed becomes more problematic and knowing we don't have the chemistry to control it well in dry beans, this is where I really encourage people to look at crop rotation as a way to manage common ragweed prior to planting dry beans. So with common ragweed, it doesn't produce a lot of seed compared to something like water hemp, several thousand seed per plant rather than tens or hundreds of thousands of seed per plant. And the seed is relatively short-lived. So it's a larger seed with a soft seed coat. So things like predation or just decay can occur over the winter, particularly if ragweed seed is left on the soil surface. So most of the ragweed will typically germinate within a couple of years of being produced. And so that's why if you have a field with a major ragweed problem, if you can get away with it or get away from planting dry beans for a 2 to 4 year window, I know 2 years will be a lot more realistic and easier for someone to go after. That would be ideal. So corn and soybeans are certainly two rotational crops that I think would be very important. So corn, we have plenty of options that still control common ragweed. And within soybeans, if we use the Extend, the Enlist, or Liberty Link platform, dicamba, 2,4-D, and then glufosinate can all control ragweed quite well. So that's, again, just showing some survey data here, but just as a reminder that we can use these rotational crops for ragweed. It will be very important to drive ragweed numbers down in the field if we want to have a successful dry bean crop in the field with a major ragweed issue. So the last topic I wanted to cover would be water hemp and some of the research that we had last year within my program. So again, just putting water hemp into perspective using the survey data, the 2020 data, if we combine the North Harvest region, water hemp was reported on 20% of the acres as a top 3 problematic weed. I should also mention many of us are also just dealing with redroot pigweed, but some of the research I'm going to present would work well on both of those pigweed species. So water hemp, redroot pigweed, pal amaranth, another one we have issues with. These programs that I'm going to show as far as water hemp control would be very equivalent for controlling redroot pigweed and pal amaranth as well. So certainly we need control options for water hemp as it continues to increase its footprint. But again, just a reminder, it controls our other pigweeds that we still have showing up on an annual basis in the survey. So one of the main reasons for water hemp becoming more problematic is just the number of herbicide sites of action we have resistance to. This is a compilation of the top 15 weeds in the world and the number of sites of action of resistance. And water hemp would be the second worst broadleaf weed in the world, following Palmer amaranth, which is up on the second line. So we talk a lot about Palmer and the issues with that. But from my perspective, water hemp is the more problematic pigweed for us and one we are dealing with on an annual basis. And we do not have or resistance to 7 different sites of action within North Dakota and Minnesota. But certainly within the North Harvest region, we do have resistance to 2 to 3 different sites of action. And so with that in mind, and I should say that, the sites of action that we have the most resistance to would be glyphosate, which we don't use in crop for dry beans. But then the group 2 herbicides, in this case, we would rely a lot on Raptor or Mazamox, and Pursuit, which is imazethapyr, to control water hemp or pigweeds in dry beans. We have quite a lot of resistance to that chemistry in water hemp. So given that background, we had a few trials last year. In this case, I'm going to present some data from Fargo, and we had a bit of an earlier planting, so we planted some pinto beans on May 10th. We had pre-plant incorporated herbicides and a pre-emergence herbicide trial. So for pre-plant incorporated, we incorporated to a depth of, should say 4 inches, apologize there. So incorporated to a depth of 4 inches, and then we planted pinto beans, and then whichever experiment or whichever treatments were pre-emergence herbicide, we applied that directly after planting. Our first rainfall event was about a 1/4 inch, 10 days after planting. Overall, the first month, it took until June 7th or 8th, so about a month after planting, to to get our first 1-inch rainfall. So again, just driving home how dry we were last May. I'm going to also present a post-emergence experiment. In that experiment, we had a blanket application of Eptam and Sonlan up front, and then once water hemp grew through that treatment to 2 inches tall, then we applied post-emergence herbicides. So as far as which herbicides we tested, here's the products that we incorporated. So we had some standalones of Eptam, Sonlan, and Treflan, and then Prowl, all 4 of those by themselves. Then we did a couple of combinations of Eptam, Sonlan, and then Eptam, Treflan. And then we also used the sulfentrazone containing treatments that we have 24C labels for in North Dakota. So we can use Spartan Charge and we can use Spartan Elite ahead of dry beans using that 24C label. We also wanted to do one combination with A-dinitrophenolane or a group 3 herbicide. So we also evaluated a tank mix of Spartan Charge plus Prowl. Again, all these incorporated to a depth of 4 inches prior to planting. The pre-emergence herbicides we selected in this trial, we looked at essentially full rates of herbicides for the soil type, which was a Fargo clay. So we looked at 2 pints of dual magnum. Then we did look at 2 different rates of outlook at 14 and 21 fluid ounces, and the same rates of Spartan Charge and Spartan Elite, this time applied pre-emergence rather than pre-plant incorporated. And then since we cannot use Prowl H2O pre-emergence in our geography, we did a tank mix of Spartan Charge plus Outlook. So again, just a tank mix to get another mode of action included with the sulfentrazone and Spartan Charge. So jumping straight into the results, this chart and the next couple will have water hemp control up to 100% on the y-axis, and then all of our herbicides as I listed them in the previous 2 charts along the bottom here. This gold line in the middle separates the pre-plant incorporated on the left from pre-emergence treatments on the right. So when we got to 4 weeks after planting, which again was our first 1-inch rainfall, overall, all these programs gave us over 90% control last year. This will be better, I think, than any other year, particularly because we planted into pretty dry soil. We essentially had 1 rainfall event by the time these ratings were taken. And so we essentially had 1 or 2 opportunities for water hemp to actually emerge. So I just wanted to show that, yes, last year we had between 90 and 99% control for all treatments. But I think 4 weeks after planting, that's a little deceiving compared to most years because we just did not have all that much water hemp emergence. So when we took this out to 8 weeks after planting, we did start to see some treatment separation. And in general, the pre-plant incorporated herbicides performed better than the pre-emergence herbicides, again, in a relatively dry environment last year. As far as the pre-plant incorporated herbicides, all the yellow chemistry and then the tank mixes, in this case, Eptam Sonlan and Eptam Treflan, all gave pretty good control, or the best control in this trial, between 85 and 99%. As far as incorporated herbicides go, Spartan Elite would have been the best sulfentrazone containing product, even though we did not have any treatment separation between the 3 sulfentrazone containing products. Then looking just at the pre-emergence results, Spartan Charge would have been the worst one for us, and this is just relying on of sulfentrazone by itself for residual control in this pre-emergence herbicide. The tank mixes where we had a group 15 product, whether that's the Dual and Spartan Elite or the Outlook, performed better, and then Dual by itself would have been the best standalone group 15 product. So moving on to present the post-emergence treatments. So for this trial, we had 11 different treatments. So I'm going to start at the bottom of this chart. We had an application of Raptor by itself at 4 fluid ounces. And this was basically to confirm that we had group 2 resistant water hemp. Then we had 5 core treatments of Bazagran, Reflex, Bazagran plus Raptor, Bazagran Reflex, and then the micro rates of Bazagran, Raptor, and Reflex all together. So the rates on the right, if the rates are in black, that represents one application of that treatment. So, and the green would represent half rates applied sequentially 7 days apart. So, looking at the Bazagran treatment, we had a treatment that was 1.6 pints of Bazagran on the 2-inch water hemp, and then another treatment was half a pint when water hemp was 2 inches, followed by another 0.8 pints 7 days later. So the half X rate. Same thing with reflex. We used a full rate of 12 fluid ounces once, and then we had 6 fluid ounces 7 days apart. So that ended up representing the 11 herbicide treatments. All treatments in this trial, we used AMS plus MSO as our adjuvants. So again, I'm just going to jump directly into the results here. And the main takeaway from this chart will be that you need reflex to control water hemp. But looking at specific treatments, again, controls up to 100%. Here along the x-axis, we have our different herbicide treatments, and we have it as the full rate and then the half rate split out 7 days apart. So for Bazagran, reflex by itself, Bazagran plus Raptor tank mix, and then Bazagran plus reflex tank mix, the micro rate applied once or twice, and then Raptor by itself. Again, the main other things to point out here, Bazagran, as we all are pretty aware of, is not a good pigweed herbicide. Very minimal symptomology applied to when we applied it to 2-inch water hemp. Same thing with Raptor by itself on a resistant population, and that tank mix of Bazagran plus Raptor, just minimal symptomology. As far as treatments that contained reflex, we got the best control when we used a full rate, so in this case 12 fluid ounces in our geography of reflex once, or when we used the tank mix of Bazagran plus reflex. In that case, it did not matter if it was the full rate of Bazagran and reflex once or the half rate of both products applied sequentially. And then when we used micro rates, we had to have the micro rate program applied twice to get the best control of water hemp. When we only applied that micro rate once, or when we just applied the half rate of reflex sequentially 7 days apart, we did see a bit of a drop off in performance. So this is I should have pointed out, results for 4 weeks after the initial treatment. So this would be 3 weeks after that second application of the split herbicide applications. So again, the main take-home point for any sort of water hemp control post-emergence, we would need reflex, but we even did see some differences in how we utilize reflex. But in general, if we use a full rate once, we saw good control, or if we used a reduced rate, we needed a tank mixed with at least Bazagran and applied twice. So that was on a water hemp population that was resistant to glyphosate and then group 2 herbicides like Raptor. What we were not able to test these programs on were water hemp populations that have resistance to the group 14 herbicides, which would have resistance to reflex, and also reduced sensitivity to sulfentrazone. So I wanted to just point out quickly here as I wrap this my talk up here, is that we do have some group 14 resistance that we are aware of on the Minnesota side within the North Harvest region. This graph or chart that I'm presenting here is now probably 4 years old. There's a compilation of research from a number of different states looking for group 14 resistant water hemp. The orange counties are counties where group 14 resistance was confirmed. And orange simply means that the most common mechanism of resistance was what was detected. So I just showed this map again to highlight that some of these orange counties are within the North Harvest growing region on the Minnesota side. And if we have group 14 resistant water hemp, that will change the anticipated results of the research I just presented. So to show this in another form, this is a slide I put together of essentially showing what's currently labeled and some of the different products that we can use for control of dry beans. So in this case, again, I showed all the individual data, but just lumping together the different pre-emergence products that have some control. And then post-emergence, we're really relying on reflex to pick up any emerged water hemp. If we have these fields with PPO resistance, that eliminates reflex, which leaves us with no effective foliar options for control of water hemp, and it would reduce the amount of control we would expect out of sulfentrazone. So typically when we talk about group 14 resistant water hemp, it's resistant to the post-emergence herbicides, but has reduced sensitivity to the pre-emergence products. So just wanted to point that out quickly here as well. So with that, I'm just going to stop here. I'm on contact information. So office phone number, email, that QR code in the bottom right will bring you to an electronic version of the weed control guide.